Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, Tina's Leg. I just want to thank you guys so much for tuning in once again. But today I have an awesome story to tell you about how we adopted my brother. My parents, I don't know how they got so lucky to have two kids with the exact same prosthetic leg and amputation. When I was 14, I went to get my annual leg made with my dad at my prosthetic location because I had to get a new leg made every year as I would grow and get taller. I would outgrow my old legs. So at 14, I went with my dad and I was in the process of getting casted for my new leg. And this little kid walks in and he's hobbling in. He was a towhead, blonde hair, blue eyes, and just in this cute little outfit. And he had the exact same prosthetic leg that I had. And I was totally shocked. So I'm 14, he's 1.5. And he comes toddling in, running with his artificial leg, and he's with this older lady, and they go and they're in the next room. We were only separated by a curtain, so we could still hear everything that was going on. In the other room, they could hear us. They had just finished casting me, and I was in the room waiting with my dad. And in the next room, I can hear them talking. The guy who does my leg, his name was Randy, he goes in the other room and he is like, "Hey Eric, how you doing?" He asks for a high five and he starts talking to the lady that brought him in. The first question he asked was, "Have you found a family to adopt Eric yet?" And I am sitting in the room next door and I'm looking at my dad and I'm like, oh my gosh, that kid is up for adoption? Like, what? She proceeded to tell him, no, they hadn't found anybody yet. They were looking for a good Christian family who knew what kind of physical needs that he would require throughout his life with having a prosthetic leg, and that they really hadn't found anybody yet. Now, the lady that was with him was significantly older, so I think she was old enough to be his grandmother. Come to find out, they had been fostering lots of kids over the years, and they were an older couple, so they were not in a place to adopt a young child just because of their age. So they took him in. My brother, well, he ended up being my brother. So Eric was a ward of the state. He was born with cancer in his lungs, and he was born with cancer in between his toes on his right foot. So he had to have the exact same amputation that I had to have due to cancer. So they cut up above his ankle bone, and he did have a heel pad that was attached to hit the bottom of his stump, but his was not the same as mine. If you watch my first video, you'll see the exact amputation that I have and what the stump looks like. And even in my last video that I did last week where I gave myself a pedicure, you get an up close and personal look at my stump and how you can see the stitching around my heel pad. My brother's, however, was slightly different, and his kind of was a little bit more bulbousy. Is that a word? Bulbous for sure is a word, but it wasn't flat. His heel pad was never completely flat like mine. He always had like a little extra bump in the front when his was attached. So I'm in the office with my dad and we are overhearing this conversation, and as the lady's talking, I am looking at my dad like, oh my gosh. Like, so my mom always wanted to have more kids. She had tried a few times after having me, and she had multiple miscarriages. And so after a while, she ended up just having a hysterectomy, and kids were kind of out of the option at that point for her. So I was an only child growing up until I was 14. And that day, everything changed for him and for our family. So he had cancer throughout his lungs and he had cancer on his foot. He was not given a very high percentage to live. They gave him chemotherapy as a baby, and miraculously, he didn't lose one head of hair during chemotherapy, and he survived. They did not think he would survive the surgery, the chemotherapy. They thought that he would die. So when his mom had him, she gave him up at birth. She made him a ward of the state. So the family that took him in and they took care of him. They took him to all his chemotherapy appointments. They took him to every doctor he needed to see, and he ended up thriving, and he beat the odds when it came to cancer and when it came to his situation. During that appointment, while we're listening, when Randy came back into our little cubicle, I told my dad, I'm like, you need to ask him about Eric, like kind of what his story is. My dad did. He talked to Randy and asked what his story was, and just told us the basics of what he knew about Eric's life and how he ended up with a prosthetic, how he ended up in foster care, and just a little bit about his foster parents. And so Randy kind of looked at my dad and was like, you guys wouldn't be interested in adopting him, would you? And my dad was like, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's very interesting. We already have a kid that has an artificial leg, and we know what it's like to raise a kid that has that kind of special need. And my wife has always wanted another kid, but she wasn't able to have another kid. So just never even thought about adoption. My parents never thought about adoption, I don't think, until that day. My dad ended up going next door and meeting the foster mom. I believe her name was Carol. Ended up meeting Carol and met Eric, interacted with him a little bit, and then they exchanged numbers. Obviously, my dad told her, I will have to go home and talk to my wife about this. Like, I came in today just intending to take my daughter to a leg appointment. I had no idea any of this would happen. But God works in mysterious ways. And you never know when your one day will happen, because one day can change your whole life, and you never know when that's going to be. And for Eric, it was that day. And for us too. So my dad went home and talked to my mom and was like, there's a little boy that came in. He had the exact same prosthetic leg as Tina, and he was a ward of the state. He beat cancer. It is a sweet older couple, but they cannot adopt him because they feel like they're too old, and they're looking for a younger Christian family who would be willing to take him in and adopt him and raise him in the best circumstances possible, where he wouldn't be treated like somebody that has a disability. After my dad got done telling my mom about my brother, my mom ended up going and calling Carol to hear for herself what Eric's story was and what even the process would look like if we were interested in possibly adopting him. And so my mom and dad went over and did multiple visits to their house, spent some time with Eric. I never saw him again, actually, until he moved into our house. And crazy enough, that was like 4 months later, and maybe even less. I feel like he moved into our house very quickly. They ended up getting an exception from the state, and we had nothing for a kid. I was 14. My parents had no idea they were going to be adopting a kid. So we got a crib from a secondhand store and some toys. He came with a handful of clothes and I think like a blanket and his favorite toy. The sweet people that did foster him, they had fostered other kids, but they did not have a lot of money. And so Eric had very little personal possessions. A lot of the stuff that he had been shared with other kids, and so they chose to keep a lot of the stuff. So it was just kind of heartbreaking when he first came in to our home. I do remember painting. I remember painting his room. I remember getting a bookshelf and lining it up with kids' books. And he really was into dinosaurs when he was a little kid. And so we got some dinosaur toys and decorations and even some cute dinosaur clothes and outfits. And it was a really sweet process. Gosh, I wasn't expecting to cry. I think the minute he moved in with us, like, we just knew he was supposed to be a part of our family. And how hard for a kid who was 1.5 years old to go from being taken out of, a foster family that's all he knew was this couple. And then he only spent a handful of hours with my parents. And I didn't even spend any time with him at all until he had moved into the house. But the one thing that he picked up on right away was the fact that we had the exact same artificial legs. And I would wake up in the morning to get ready for school, and I would look around my room and my artificial leg would be gone. Eric had the room right next to me, and I would open the door, and sitting there on his shelf would be my leg and his leg right next to mine. And he would just usually be he'd be cross-legged, sitting on the floor, like just grinning at me. He always was a mischievous kid, always. But it was so cute because it was like he knew I would be upset probably that he took my leg from me, but he would sneak into my room and take my leg, and he just loved to like look at our legs side by side. I think for him that was common ground. Like, he wasn't alone, he wasn't the only one that had a prosthetic, and I think that helped make him feel more at home in our house. I used to be a towhead when I was little, bright blonde hair, and Eric was a towhead. He had bright blonde hair and blue eyes, and my dad has blue eyes. And so he looked like he just belonged in our family. Like, he just fit right in. So the process of adoption for my parents was actually really easy because when they met with the foster care people, they had great favor with them, and then they had to work with the state for the adoption process. And I have to tell you that I was a teenager. I don't know how all the process worked. I just know it happened super fast. He was living in our home within 4 months, maybe less. And the whole adoption process from beginning to end did not take longer than a year. That's how I ended up with a little brother, and my parents ended up with 2 kids that had the exact same prosthetic legs. I do have some pictures that I am going to show you. There's a picture of us getting ready to dive into a swimming pool, and we both don't have our legs on, so you can see both of our stumps. And he was such a cute kid. I taught him how to swim. I may or may not have terrorized him in the water in the process, because that is what older siblings are supposed to do. But that's a cute picture of us. During this picture, I think I was 16 or 17 at the time. So we had him for a few years. I think he was 4 or 5 in this picture. And then there is a picture of him mowing the lawn with my dad, and you can see the back of his leg, and that is closer to what he looked like when we first adopted him. He was probably two years old in this picture, and that was exactly what my leg looked like from the back as well. Again, growing up in Arizona, I wore shorts all the time. And so we would go everywhere we went as a family. We would walk in and you would see 2 kids with this exact same prosthetic leg. One time, we were getting ready to get passports for our family. My mom and dad and I were going to take a trip to the Philippines to do some mission work. as we were in the office trying to get the passport forms filled out and all of that, my dad, I think he was holding my brother, and so you could see my brother's artificial leg, and I was sitting in the chair and you could see my leg because I was wearing shorts, and there was a lady that would not stop staring. She would not stop staring at us. And my dad had put my brother down, and I think my brother even sat in my lap, and we were just sitting there waiting our turn. And so our legs were right next to each other. You could see both of us had the exact same prosthetic. And this lady was staring so much that my dad leaned over and he said, "So it's a ritual in our family that we cut the right foot off of every child that we have." You kind of get the idea of where I get my sixth sense of humor from. I do come by it honestly. Anyway, that lady was so embarrassed. She got up and went to the restroom, and my dad never saw her even come back out. So I think she hid in there until we left. Needless to say, life was never boring in our home. I am going to share two of the most memorable things that occurred when he was a little kid. And I ended up, because of my age and how young he was, I was sort of a built-in babysitter for my parents. I went from being a pretty carefree teenager, not having to worry about a whole lot, to having a little brother that now I also had to help take care of. When we would go to the grocery store, I would be pushing the cart. My mom would always be ahead, going through the aisles, putting the groceries in the cart. And if I turned around and did something, my brother, his leg, it didn't stay on as well as most legs do, because making a prosthetic for a little kid is actually pretty challenging, because they don't have all the words to say, "Oh, it doesn't feel right here," or "it hurts here." Didn't have the greatest technology to make his foot be able to suction in at the bottom very well because of the shape of his stump. So his legs never really fit super great. Like, they would go on and he'd be able to walk and run around and everything like that was fine. But as far as it staying on when he was in a cart or on a swing, he could flip his leg off very easily because it didn't suction very well onto his leg. So in the middle of the grocery store, as we're walking down the aisle, if my mom asked me to come look at something and I would turn my back, I would literally come back and his leg would be gone, completely gone. And he would kick his leg off and you would hear it crashing in the store. Sometimes he would flip it off and it would land on top of a shelf. Sometimes you would just hear it, this cracking sound as it hit the ground at the grocery store. And I don't know how, but I always ended up getting yelled at for that. And I think that's why he did it over and over again, because I would get in trouble because I wasn't watching him. I would get so mad at my mom. I'm like, "You try and keep this kid's leg on. Like, I just can't do it." She would yell at him and try everything she could to try and get him to be able to keep his leg on in the grocery store. And truthfully, we ended up having to be able to we would take his leg off and put it in the back of the cart the entire time at the grocery store, because any chance he got, he loved to be able to just kick his leg would just go flying in the air and land somewhere, to the point where the managers at the grocery store that we shopped at knew him very well. And sometimes we would hear over the loudspeaker, "Eric, you need to keep your leg on. We see you. Aisle 3, we see you. Keep your leg on." I don't think that ever ended up working, because he would still do it. And then the other thing that he would do to me always is, we had a little stroller. So he would lay back in his stroller and then he would drag his leg under the wheel of the stroller, so that when I would push the stroller forward, his leg would just pop off. And usually it would be when we were in a store at a mall or something like that. So there's carpet on the ground. So I would never hear the leg come off. I wouldn't hear it. He did it in such a way where I guess I I didn't even see it or I wouldn't step on it. That was tricky because he would let his leg slide off. And sometimes it would be like a half an hour later, we would realize he didn't have his leg on. And we would have to go back and retrace our steps everywhere through the store in order to find his leg. Sometimes somebody would have turned it into to the registers and we would have to go up and ask, did anybody turn in an artificial leg? Oh my gosh. I think he did something with his leg everywhere we went. Like he just looked for opportunities to lose his leg, let it come off, let it fling off. I think he just loved the attention and he loved to drive us crazy, and especially me as his sister. I am 13 years older than him, and he has had a very different journey in life than I have. I got married at 19. We only lived in the same house for 5 years. I pretty much grew up as an only child except for those 5 years. And then, so he was only 7 when I got married. So then from 7 until 18, he pretty much was an only child. So we didn't spend a lot of time growing up together except for that overlapping time period. I am gonna go and interview my brother next week. So next week's video is going to be me interviewing him and getting his side of the story. I'm gonna ask him what some of his very first memories are of being in our family, and he's gonna share a little bit about his journey and what that looked like for him growing up. My brother actually had to have his leg amputated more due to a situation that occurred, and so he, in the last few years, have a totally different prosthetic. He does have a below the knee amputation now. When we interview him, he's gonna show you his leg, he's gonna show you his prosthetic, and even the transition of going to being able to walk. We both were able to walk on our stumps because we only had about a 3-inch limp, and he was in the exact same boat. But now, because he had to have his leg amputated a little bit higher, he is not able to walk without it, and I know that has been a pretty tough transition for him over the last couple years. But he is doing really well with it now. His story is a little bit different than mine, and we are going to learn about it next week. Thank you so much for watching today. I totally appreciate you guys tuning in, watching my channel. Thank you for liking and subscribing and commenting down below. I appreciate all of it. It's been a fun journey so far. I hope you guys have a great week, and don't forget, every day is leg day.